Okay. Hello, everybody. It's so fun. It's so fun to have. I think it's a mostly central crowd. We also have friends from St. Peter's Church who are here. I know we have friends from Park Avenue Synagogue as well. As someone just said, I'm from KJ. So I love that this is like a little bit of just like Jewish and friends in this conversation, this larger conversation about this moment that we're in and this incredible book that my dear friend, Rabbi Elliot Cosgrove, just published. So just a few words. I think you don't really need an introduction in this crowd, but I'll say a few things. Rabbi Cosgrove has been the senior rabbi at Park Avenue Synagogue since 2008. He has revitalized and energized this flagship conservative congregation, which has flourished under his leadership. And of course, his rabbinate extends far beyond his synagogue. He is a rabbi for New Yorkers. He is a rabbi for larger America. He is a leader in the conservative movement, and of course, for Jews in Israel and all around the world. Rabbi Cosgrove came to Park Avenue Synagogue 2 years after I came to Central Synagogue as the senior cantor at the time. And when he came, I don't think that there was any other senior rabbi on the east side that was under the age of 60. And so it was really nice to have a colleague that was like my age. And our Rebbitzins became friends. My husband's here and his wife is going to be here. And maybe even more importantly, all our children attended the Heschel School together, and all of them were friends, but in particular, our youngest ones were really best buddies together, and that was really a wonderful thing for both of them and our families. About a decade ago, when I became the senior rabbi at Central Synagogue, one of the first things that happened that included the two of us was Rabbi Chaim Steinmetz at KJ invited us for a panel for the three of us to speak at his synagogue, which was really significant. It was a beautiful moment, and it kind of became the beginning of the threesome of us being on the road doing kind of talking tours for Israelis who couldn't believe the three of us liked each other and all those things. But I will just share one quick story, which is just that we thought we were really very interesting, but our children who were all there did not think we were so interesting. And so all our children went over to Elliot's apartment, which was a block away from KJ, and they just hung out there while we did the panel. At the end of the panel, I walked over to pick up my children from Elliot's house, and they had spent like the hour and a half making a list of like all the bests and worsts of being rabbi's kids. And like they're like, here are the best perks, here are the most like terrible expectations, and so I've always been very grateful that our children had each other for the good and the bad. I would say that for me as well to have Rabbi Cosgrove, he's one of my first calls when I want to talk shop, because actually while it's a conservative synagogue and a reform synagogue, we actually have the same people in our communities very much, and we share a lot of families where I've got one brother and he's got the sister or whatever it is, There's just a way that there's a lot of similarities between our communities and the way we function, even though they're not obviously exactly the same. And so it's just been a gift over the years to be able to talk about, how we're doing things, what we're thinking about, sermon ideas, all those things. So it is such a privilege to kind of feel like we get to be in this conversation together. And the way I'd like to think of it, and shared with Rabbi Cosgrove, was, in some ways, I'd like to have this conversation that this book brought up, which I felt like, it was almost like therapy reading your book for me. All of these things that I've been struggling with, which Rabbi Cosgrove really articulated so powerfully, that in some ways we get to have that internal conversation in a way that we might have if I were picking up the phone, but everyone is invited to be kind of part of that conversation and to listen in with us. And so I hope it feels less formal. I don't know how many of these book talks you've done, but it really is in some ways a conversation between two colleagues and friends. So let's begin. I actually want to start kind of before.
Can I just...
You want to do rebuttal already? Okay.
Can I just say all the nice things that Rabbi Buchdahl said about me, with the exception of leader of the conservative movement, leader of the reform movement, like times 10 for Rabbi Buchdahl. And amazing colleague, civic, national movement, religious leader of our time, and of all of her credentials. For me, as the rabbi indicated, the title of friend is the one that I treasure most. It is a we have the best jobs in the world, and sometimes it can also be a lonely job, and you need to know someone who is walking the same journey as you, and a rabbi needs a rabbi, and Rabbi Buchdahl is my rabbi.
I feel the same. Thank you.
So it's a little disorienting because we schmooze all the time privately. We're now doing it publicly here, and I just want to thank Rabbi Buchdahl, the Central community, as well as everyone here for such a gracious welcome.
We love having you. Thank you. We're going to get to October 7th and a post-October 7th world, but your book actually begins a little before that. And I'd like to ask you to go to the before first, if you don't mind. As you know, and you've talked about, we actually are seeing a pipeline problem, not enough people who want to go into our profession and become rabbis. Can you tell us what inspired you to go into this wonderful, beautiful, crazy line of work that we do of becoming a rabbi? What made you want to be a rabbi, Elliot?
So the story probably begins long before I was born. I am not...
Such a rabbinic way to start, isn't it?
My grandfather of blessed memory was a rabbi in Glasgow, Scotland. And so I never knew him. He was leaving this world as I was entering this world, but he was an Orthodox rabbi. And so I always grew up with stories about what that nice Jewish kids grow up to be doctors, lawyers, or rabbis. I have a brother who's in the movie business, a brother who works at YouTube. My parents find that intriguing. There is nothing interesting about my choice to grow up to be a rabbi. There's no story about when did Elliot find religion. That said, and I tell this incident in my book, about my vision for Jewish identity, Judaism was always something that happened when I was home. And when I went to University of Michigan, proud Jew, wasn't rejecting anything, but it was really something I did when I went home until an incident my junior year of college, and a gentleman named Mr. Gendon. He was a Holocaust survivor. He was a person we always had for Shabbat dinner, for Passover Seder. I got a call that he had passed away. And not knowing what to do, but knowing that I wanted to honor him, and I associated him with his Jewish identity, I had never actually been in the Hillel on campus at University of Michigan. I had been in the student union for high holiday services, and I called one of my Jewishy friends, and I said, "Where's the Hillel?" And he said, "You're an idiot. It's this huge building right in the center of campus. You pass it all the time." And I went in, I said Kaddish at the end of the service, and as I was leaving, like at the end of the flight, just to dash out, because I already had plans that Friday night, someone sort of boxed me out at the door, and I tried to get away, and this gentleman said, "I notice you've never been here before." And I'm thinking to myself, this person has an astute sense of the obvious. I just found out about this building about an hour ago. And he said, "Well, I'd like to invite you to Shabbat dinner." And I lied, because I figured he didn't want to know about dollar pitcher night at Rick's that night. And I said, "I already have Shabbat plans." And he said, "Well, I bet you don't have Shabbat plans next week." And I was caught, and I said, "You're right." And he said, "Good, so you'll come over for Shabbat dinner." And at that moment, I went to Shabbat dinner. I was on the Student Journal. I was on the governing board. Went to rabbinical school. I got a PhD, and here I am tonight. But my take home of that is
box him in.
To box him in. But as Rabbi Buchdahl knows, there's all sorts of prescriptive steps for how to save the Jewish people. I never forget that this is a retail business. just like this week's Torah reading. It's Oseh Nefashot. It's one soul at a time. It's to come into services as you do week in, week out at Central Synagogue, and look for the person who looks a little out of place. It's the first time there, and greet that person warmly, and just make that person feel at home. That has sort of forever been the North Star of my rabbinate.
What a beautiful answer. And yes, and such a reminder of also just the invitation. Like when we make that invitation and how much you have no idea how that can kind of change the course of someone's life. Beautiful. So this book, you describe this as responding to the urgency of the hour, but I have known you now for 17 years, I think, and you've had to respond to the urgency of the hour regularly. Like, I think there have been many urgent things that we've talked about over the many years. What made you write this book at this time?
So I'll take a step back and then take a step. I keep doing that. It really must be a rabbinic muscle group.
Jews always look backwards.
So the
to go
title of the
forward.
book is For Such a Time as This. And it takes its cue from the biblical book of Esther, which we read in the spring, the story of the Jewish community of ancient Persia who thought they had it good, life was good, they were comfortable. And Esther, whose Hebrew name means to hide, hid her identity as she entered into the palace of King Ahasuerus. She ascended to the heights of power as queen. And again, the going was good until, of course, the wicked decree of Haman came down and the fate of the Jewish people was on the line. Mordecai, by way of an emissary, tells his niece, don't think you're going to escape the decree of Haman, and who knows if not for such a time as this that you arrived at your station in life. And we know how the story goes, and Esther comes out as a woman, as a queen, as a Jew, and the day is saved. And so that is why the book is titled what it is, because it's an Esther moment, October 7th, which we'll get into, of Jewish identity. The whiplash we all felt of where did this come from, how did this happen, and in this moment of time, what is being asked of us? And so like you, Rabbi, I found myself playing roles that I wasn't prepared for, that no one can be prepared for. And we responded as New York rabbis with advocacy, with civic leadership, with making the case for Israel. And because we share many of the same member families, I can say such things. There are certain things we can do better than your typical rabbi. Number one is to be a voice for the Jewish people. Number two is to raise money on behalf of Israel and for trauma relief and through the UJA Israel Emergency Campaign, which we did. And then the other thing we do is we craft words. And for me, the opportunity was to try to write something, and there was a dance done. You know, you know better than anyone that I've wanted to write something for a while, and this was a moment where they said, if you can write something that appears in September at the anniversary, before the election, you know, it's called crashing a book, then you got yourself a deal. And so it was a very intense writing process, and the book is meant to be a sort of a lexicon, a vocabulary for all the tough conversations we're having about diaspora Israel, anti-Zionism, anti-Semitism, the generational divide, right? Really, not so much that people agree or disagree what's in it, but that it's a toolbox for people to have the conversations on the issues of the hour.
I think that's a brilliant way to kind of express sort of at the core what this book is about. Like it is a post-October 7th book, but it's really addressing all the kind of biggest questions that we're asking as modern Jews today in a post-October 7th world. I just have to say that as someone who is now in my 4th year working on the same book, the fact that he put this together in 4 months, I am very impressed that you managed to pull that off and write it so beautifully. It really is amazing. So let's talk a little bit about that October 7th, like what felt like, I know in that first week you did a phenomenal job of really rallying your community to fundraise and really say these are immediate primary needs that we have. What did the next couple of months look like? What did your days look like? What worried you the most in those early hours, early months?
Well, just what you know is that to be a pastor is you can't compartmentalize overly so, meaning when we are caring for an individual and a family and loss and illness, or like we ourselves are affected and because we're human beings and empathetic human beings at that. And so the first thing I want to say in response to your question is that I was going through something myself on a deeply personal level. I begin the book by talking about the wake-up call, literally, when, I don't know if my wife Debbie is here, but her phone kept ringing because my nephew was called into, that was that morning that we'll never forget. And so at the very moment that I'm walking to synagogue, trying to figure out what to say to my community, how to mobilize, how to address it or not to address it, even as we didn't know what was going on, I'm also saying, oh my gosh, not sort of some abstract global Jewish family, which of course I feel and we all feel, but actual family. Our WhatsApp were lighting up at the time, and they're still lighting up at this moment. So I was I was on a deeply personal level going through this with my loved ones, my cousins, my nephew, being called up to serve, and the very moment that trying to lead a community. And then it, we can get into it, but the question of playing, becoming advocates for Israel through philanthropy, through communal leadership, mobilizing those marches that we went down to in D.C., here in New York, at the UN, really sort of turning into a community organizer in the classic sense, and at the same time, doing rabbinic work, hatching, matching, and dispatching people, as pastors tend to do. So that's like a rabbinic inside joke. So it was walking and chewing gum all at the same time.
Yeah, I resonate very much with the feeling that I was trying to manage also my own emotional response, also with family in Israel, also with what a cousin going back into reserve duty. And, we say a lot of times that part of our job is just maintaining non-anxious presence is almost part of, what it is to be a rabbi. And this was, I think, the most challenging year for me personally of being able to hold people's fear and anxiety and trauma when I was feeling a lot of it myself at the same time.
Right, and I think for us, and I'd be curious we were just coming out of COVID, we were coming out of, these are moments where...
And a year of judicial reform that we were worried already about Israel, and then, but October 7th made the year before feel almost, quaint or something, or just certainly not as, just different, yeah. I love this chapter. It spoke to me personally about hyphenated identities. He said, to live a hyphenated life is not an outcome or destination, is a perpetual state of being. It means that life is a balancing act between the competing commitments within each of us. So I've often, I live as a Korean, American, Jewish immigrant. I could add a bunch more hyphens, but I definitely understand that sense of feeling like for a lot of my life, I felt like if I was seen as Korean, I was seen as not Jewish. If I was seen as Jewish, that I couldn't really be Korean. And where did American fit into all of this? So I certainly really resonated with that. And I think that we've been asked that question before. Are you a Jewish American or an American Jew? In some way, is there one that takes priority over the other? Is that dual loyalties? So I want to ask you, how do you see your hyphenated identity, you personally? Did it change in any way after October 7th? Like, did it feel like one got more priority or more kind of dominance? And I'm curious because I heard more this year than any other election I've been a part of some Jews saying, I'm a one-issue voter right now, I'm voting about Israel and anti-Semitism. And is that, the charge of dual loyalties, that actually you're voting for a different loyalty than what is America's interest? So I'm just curious around this sense of like competing identities, loyalties, hyphenated identities. Where do you fall in this, and what do you think might have changed either first for you, but also maybe that you noticed in the Jewish community?
The Rabbi Judah Magnus at Temple Emmanuel of blessed memory of about 100 years ago gave a sermon talking about against the play, Zangwill's play, The Melting Pot, and said, no, the American dream is not a melting pot. The American dream is rather one of a symphony of American life where everyone plays their own instrument in their own timbre and tonality, and that's what makes America America. And that, I think, was very much the dream or the illusion that right, there are Asian Americans, there's Jewish Americans, there's evangelical Americans. We're all a little different, but we're all American, and that's what makes America America. And then I think the whiplash, not totally, it's difficult to do this in broad brushstrokes, because I think part of the subplot of October 7th is that it was experienced differently by different generations. I think for some, this was a big I told you so, right? You thought America was the exception to the rule. You thought that there's anti-Semitism in Europe and otherwise, but America's different, and a lot of finger wagging, right? But for a lot of other people, and I would probably put myself in this category, that whereas of course we know that there were Pittsburgh and Poway's and otherwise, Charlottesville's, we thought we were exceptional. In some way. And then October 7th happened, and within hours of the vicious attacks, there were already claims that Israel victimized was actually the aggressor. And we all sort of said, where did this come from? How did this happen? What were we not telling ourselves? And the way I put it in the book is that there are two formulated, it's actually very appropriate given the Torah readings we're in right now. Prior to the Torah reading of last week, Lech Lecha, is God calling out to Abraham to go forth, to go to the land that I will show you, and to be a blessing, Heyeh Bracha. A very positive self-identification with the positive pull of what it is to be a Jew. And then, in the very first verses of Exodus, a new Pharaoh arises who didn't know Joseph, and the Hebrews of Egypt were other, they were different, perhaps a fifth column, to be feared, to be oppressed, and hated. That's the Exodus. Daniel Hartman, our teacher, talked about Exodus and Genesis Jews in a very different way, but this notion of an Exodus Jew and a Genesis Jew, I think, is relevant for October 7th, because people may or may not have identified as Genesis Jews prior, right? People had various levels of engagement with the tradition, with community, and otherwise. But on October 7th, we all became Exodus Jews. The hyphen was sort of snapped, and we all realized that we were other in some way, which caught us all off guard. And so that wake-up call has really been the story since. and not to get ahead of myself, but the challenge is how to be eyes wide open to this Exodus chapter of being a Jew, but never forgetting that the point of being Jewish is to be a blessing. And so that's really the challenge. But can I ask you, because as someone who has spoken publicly about your hyphenated identities as a woman, as an Asian American, as how this moment of October 7th has felt. Am I allowed to do this? Am I allowed to ask you a question?
Yeah, of course.
So, I don't remember. I mean, did you find yourself, was it a wake-up call for you? Were you surprised? Or was it more sort of like, oh, this is just, we saw this coming?
I definitely didn't see October 7th coming, but, first of all, I would say maybe even 5 years ago, I think I gave a sermon on anti-Semitism for the high holidays. I remember at that time when I gave it, there were some who criticized and sort of said, this is one of the main things you think is the most important thing to talk about right now. It was 6 weeks before Pittsburgh happened, though, actually, and that, of course, we could have never known it. But I remember already at that point we were seeing things, and mostly it came from Europe, where people who were leaders in Europe said, we're seeing what is happening in America, and this is what it was like for us 10 years ago, and we just want you to know if you don't start saying something, it's going to be too late. We didn't do enough in the beginning when we could have spoken out. So it was one of those things where I was like, I have been surprised by, not that there is anti-Semitism, how normalized some of the talk is in a way, where it's happening. I think that we were used to seeing it maybe in certain circles. We were less used to seeing it from our cultural institutions, from writers, from academics, from all of that. And so I think it's where it's coming from, which were places where Jews felt the most at home. That was very surprising. And I have been very torn about, I don't think this is 1930s Germany, but I think there are pieces of what we're seeing that we should be greatly alarmed by. And I think that I struggle with this question all the time, like how much I'm supposed to be sounding an alarm bell, or how much I'm supposed to say, no, we can fight this, and we are, and so I don't think that's a great answer, except to say that I think that my Jewish identity has kind of floated to the top of sort of my primary identity I'm operating under right now. I don't know if that's a good answer, but I think,
Right, but I think you're right. I think it also came to the fore with an election season, right? When people were asking that question, right, very directly, whether this is the moment to put, whatever our views are on, reproductive rights and, immigration, the economy, whatever the 10 issues are, do we put that aside and say, in a moment of crisis, we vote with, our Jewish and, advocacy for Israel? Not that that was clear.
Which candidate was a better candidate for that, actually, or maybe you do have some clarity on that.
Right.
But I would just say that I think
my congregants agree with everything I say.
Yeah.
From the
mine
pulpit.
too. Right? Don't you?
So I don't know, how's that here? This is, you just say who to vote for, and everyone just says, Rabbi Buchdahl has spoken.
Yes, that's kind of how it works. Jews. Yeah. I think when it comes to Israel also, I know you well enough to know how deeply central Israel is to your Jewish identity. And yet you do not advocate for Israel becoming the religion of American Jews. So, spell that out for me a little bit. How do you separate out the fact that for you, Israel is central to your Judaism, so deeply central? And I think you would aspire to have all of your Jews feel that way, and yet you don't want it to become the religion of American Jews. So what's that line?
So
what's the difference?
I'm constitutionally incapable of having a Jewish identity without Israel being central to it. For me, I didn't choose to live in this time, but I was, and so there's Shabbat, there's community, there's Torah, there's Israel. For me, to not engage with the miraculous presence of a sovereign Jewish state is an abdication of Jewish identity. Period out. And as I talk about in the chapter on
I'm
the
just
invisible
quoting you in the book,
thread,
Elliot.
Israel is not equal to Judaism or the other way around. So this kind of gets into the generational divide, because I think it was a wrong turn that American Jewry made along the way. So I'll situate it with my historic 1924, 100 years ago this year, was the establishment not of Hadassah, but of the first hospital that Hadassah established in Israel. And another fabulous book by Francine Klagsburn on Henrietta Zold describes how that pragmatic Zionism for the 1910s and otherwise for American Jewry acclimating into America was important, of course, for pre-state Israel, but it was also an organizing principle, a scaffolding for American Jewry itself. And so not just Hadassah, but all the alphabet soup of Jewish communal life with Zionism at its backbone served pre-state and the establishment of the state, and it served as sort of a civil structure for who we are as American Jews. And that's great, that's terrific. Until that Zionism or advocacy for Israel became a substitute religion for Judaism itself. So if I were to graph this out, I would, to say something, we shouldn't just agree, I say something a little controversial, that I think that our Israel engagement became a substitute religion for a paper-thin American Jewish identity. Because it's much easier to debate, at what point uranium is enriched or the terms by which America should or shouldn't enter into an agreement with Iran than it is to keep your kids home on a Friday night for Shabbat dinner. It's much easier to call someone a colonialist oppressor or self-hating Jew than it is to be concerned with your children or grandchildren's Jewish identity. And so this organizing scaffolding became a religion, and in some senses it became an orthodoxy. Someone earlier had a relationship with Rabbi Arthur Hertzberg, not a romantic one, a rabbinic one, and said that our Hertzberg of blessed memory said the only thing that you could be excommunicated in American Jewry is dissent with the Israeli government. And I think I call it the OJC, the Organized Jewish Community, paid a price for that. Because when you make assent with a government, which has its strengths and has its weaknesses, the threshold test for entrance into the Jewish conversation, then you only have yourself to blame when someone who feels that gap between their sensibility and the decisions of the Israeli government, that they don't have a place in the Jewish conversation. And that happens on an individual level, that happens on a congregational level, that happens when the Conference of Jewish Presidents disallows certain left-leaning groups from entering into the Jewish conversation. And there is an underbelly. Sorry for the long-winded answer, but there is a danger to blurring the line between Zionism and Judaism.
I agree with that completely. I think I would complicate it a little bit more, though, because I don't think it's just that the line is if you critique the government. I think I've read enough of your sermons, Elliot, and I think many people here know where you stand, that you are, deeply engaged with Israel, and you have given many sermons that can be critical of the government. I don't think that's the line where you're out. I think the line is if you say, I reject its right to exist at all, and I've made great pains to say Israel is more than just its government. I think, for example, we're about to go into, a period of our government where actually patriotism might be critiquing the government. And so I think that I think always engagement and critique is actually part of what it is to be in loving relationship or in relationship with almost anything we care about.
Right.
So
My wife just walked in.
Right. So I guess it's more that, is there a line where there is there a line where you do think that you're outside the Jewish community if you sort of say, I don't even think Israel should exist at all. There should be no state of Israel. Is that the line?
Within the Jewish, we're not
Within the
talking
OJC.
about. We're not talking about anti-Zion people who seek Israel's destruction. We're talking about the kids who grew up. I'm just clarifying.
Yeah.
Okay. So it's an interesting. It's a very urgent question because
Right.
there are those voices within the Jewish community who identify as non-Zionist, right? There's an entire chapter in my book on an imagined dialogue, which wasn't imagined, with a non-Zionist Gen Zer. What to do with this individual. And some of our colleagues have said that individual has a place in the conversation, but the organizations, I don't like Jewish Voices, I don't know all, whatever the acronyms are, that those aren't invited into our communities, right? We don't need to give them space on the bima on a Friday night, but if that young college student walks into your office, and then that person needs to be engaged. I do have colleagues, you have colleagues, New York colleagues, who have said we have to write that generation off. We have to just be done with it. They're enemies. I have a big tent view of this conversation, and so I'll say this in such a way because my daughter just walked in. So the chapter with Maya, not her real name, is a conversation with a young woman who grew up at in my kitchen in my household, who said, there's something very personal about this book because I joke that this individual shares half a brain with my daughter. And so it's not an abstract Maya, it's the Mayas of our time, of our families who have grown up in Jewish summer camp, many gone to Jewish day school. These are our children. And what do we do with them in this moment? And I think they need to be engaged. I think we cannot exclude them from the tent, which is not to say that every idea needs to be dignified or coddled. But I think that there is a way, right, given the fact that dissent, right, hundreds of thousands of Israelis on any given Saturday night are protesting the Israeli government as an expression of their love of country. So to tell a young person they can't do that doesn't hold water. And they have grown up with the only government they know being the Netanyahu government. The only policy of Israel they know is an expansionist policy in the West Bank. Right. The only paradigm they have is that of Israel being the Goliath to the Palestinian David, right? A French philosopher once said that everyone's destined to live in the time into which they are born. You can't blame someone for their reality. So that said, ask a good question. Okay, so you don't believe in a nation state of the Jews. Israel presently is surrounded by a ring of fire. Houthis, Hezbollah, Hamas, Iran in the backdrop. They're not arguing over where a border is or a he said, she said of history. They want Israel gone, wiped off the map, period out. So what did Golda Meir say? That if the Arabs put down their arms today, there would be peace tomorrow. If the Jews put down their arms today, there'd be no Israel tomorrow. So what is your vision for 47% of the Jewish people who live there for their safety and security? Ask a question like that, and then do the most important thing of all. Stop talking. Just stop. Prompt that young person to give voice to their answer to the threat that Israel faces with their progressive sensibility. Now, let me manage expectations. Odds are that person will not, acknowledge that you're right and they're right. Most human beings, right? You don't have a big argument with someone and they say, I'm really glad we argued. You're right, I'm wrong, let's move on, right? I don't do that. Other people don't do that. But here's what might happen. That young mind, when they go back to campus, might think twice about entering an encampment and standing next to a placard that says "From the river to the sea." They might be a little more intentional and discerning in aligning themselves with a cause that ultimately does not secure the safety of the Jewish people. So, in other words, I look long on the Maya generation.
I'm with you on that, and I would say that I've had some very amazing conversations with young people who are coming from a very strong moral place and are often raising questions that I don't have just a neat, easy answer to, because this is a very hard situation. And I think in the same way that I know you and I still believe deeply that there has to be a two-state solution, but we don't have a clear path of how that's going to happen. I think that our kids often feel like this war can't keep happening even if they can't give us a clear path of how it's supposed to end and people are supposed to stay safe. And I think that we're going to have to live with some unresolved issues at times. And to me, just the fact that they're as passionate as they are gives me hope that they actually still deeply care. Even your anger comes from a place of actually engagement and care in some way. So I have not given up on them either. We have so little time, but one of the kind of most striking stories in your book is the story of your cousins who ended up in England. You ended up here. You have family in Israel. But when your cousins were teenagers, essentially they got attacked by a mob who just like really literally because they were Jews started beating them up and beating up one of them so badly that he was basically beaten unconscious and had lifelong health issues from there on out. It's hard to think about that attack in the light of what we just saw with these mob attacks in Amsterdam in the last week. We know that that's not an isolated thing in the last year. You told the story of just how your young cousins actually started running to neighbors' houses and knocking on the doors, and they saw them and just closed the door on them. And that there were virtually no repercussions for the mob that hurt them. And yet, of course, had massive repercussions for your cousins, completely changed their lives. 2 of them moved to Israel because of this. One of them immediately lost all his hair and had a case of alopecia. One learns how to box so he can actually defend himself. So, and you say response to trauma and suffering is either empathy or vigilance. And I'm wondering, in the face of what we are facing right now, what is your response to what you're seeing that is both, verbal and in some cases physical, and knowing what you know from your own family story? What is our response to what we're seeing now?
Yeah, that story is very much part of my DNA, and it was Yair Lapid who once had a pithy turn of a phrase that he said, "The secret to Jewish identity is I could be you and you could be me," meaning in my own personal story, if you've ever wondered what sort of Jewish name is Cosgrove, it's British, and if my dad hadn't moved to Los Angeles, I would have been, right, with my cousins that day. And so that sense that, and it also ties into, what we see going on in Amsterdam and Europe, and right now is a sense of connectivity. The empathy and vigilance question for me is a false binary that the present moment has given us, right? So you either defend Israel or you have empathy for the Palestinians. You're either on the left or you're on the right, and never shall the two connect. And my contention in the chapter on the subject is that that's a false choice. And the text that I teach from in that chapter is a Passover Seder, because you can have an authentic read of the Passover Seder, the Haggadah, that we start the Seder by saying, all who are hungry, you have a place at the table, that we will, we were once strangers in a strange land, therefore you shall know the heart of a stranger, that this idea of empathy for the other is what being Jewish is all about. And I could give other proof texts for that. There is also a strand within the Haggadah that you know, which is the passage that says, in every generation a new Pharaoh arises to destroy us, and therefore we have to be vigilant. Many people sing Eliyahu Hanavi when we open the door for Elijah the prophet, but if you know the Haggadah, then you know that the actual text that says is Shvo chamatcha al hagoyim asher lo yeda'ucha, pour out the wrath upon the nations, right? This is rough stuff. This is vigilance, and sometimes it's vengeance. They're both part of the Haggadah, and they're both like the double helix of the Jewish DNA. And so I think that now is a moment that Israel needs to fight this fight for survival as if there's no tomorrow. And Israel needs to fight this fight with an eye to tomorrow. That the reason we're fighting is for peace, and that Palestinian self-determination is not a concession, but is an act of Zionist expression, that if you are invested in a secure Jewish democratic state of Israel, then you should be, not just because Jews know that everyone deserves a place to hang their hat, but because we want Israel to live side by side in peace with its Palestinian neighbors. And the present cultural moment doesn't allow that to be said, right? Which is why I wrote this book, because I think the people holding the megaphones right now are the ones who are at the polar extremes, saying you're all about the encampments or you're all about the other side. And you as a community are blessed with a leader who's saying, no, it's actually both. We fight the fight against anti-Semitism, and we fight Israel's fight as advocates, and we look to the day after.
Yeah. So much of your work in the last year, and what I'm sure your people have been asking you to do, and you've been called to do, is fighting anti-Semitism in this last year. And yet you also said, put simply, to reduce my Jewish identity to fighting anti-Semitism is a victory I refuse to grant my foe. So what do you do? How do you balance this, Rabbi, of your job, fighting anti-Semitism, and where you spend your energy, and what you think your primary job will need to be?
Look, it goes back to the Exodus and Genesis Jews, right? We have to remember the model of positive Jewish identification. And I think that the challenge of this hour is to walk and chew gum at the same time, to advocate and at the same time to remember that you and I went to rabbinical school not to become agents for AIPAC or J Street or some other organization. We love Jews and we love Judaism, and we want to share that love with the people we serve. And so one of my fears of this moment well, for me, I feel very, I don't want to say comfortable. I would not choose this moment for everything. This is a terrible moment and a horrific moment. We have seen, and you've experienced, I've experienced, that some people call it October 8th Jews, a surge, an awakening. There are all sorts of different labels, but people are engaged in a way that I haven't seen in my career. Philanthropically, advocacy. It happens in quiet moments in my office. Couples where one of the partners is wondering, they were on the fence about conversion and da-da-da-da, and now all of a sudden this is a time to literally take that leap into the mikveh. That
Very
is,
inspiring, yeah.
so I have a million private pastoral stories of an awakening of Jewish identity. The question, and if you have an answer for this, I'd love to hear it, is how do you extend the tail of this surge beyond trauma? Because I don't want the trauma, right? What are we, 404 days into the hostages being in captivity? The war is getting worse. It's not getting better. And I pray for the day it's over, the hostages are freed. And it was great to be a Jew on October 6th. It's great to be a Jew today. So I do have a chapter on mitzvot, on positive Jewish identification, about creating communities like your own, of meaning, of having inspiring leaders like you who bring people closer to tradition, having a team of amazing educators like Shira who are explaining to people both the what and the how-to. So in this day of pelotons and training for, I don't see any reason why the Jewish community can't adapt the technology of the day to meet the aspirations of a searching American Jewry.
Well, I'll share one teaching that I think actually ended up being part of one of my colleagues, Rabbi Cosgrove's High Holiday sermons. But there is a line in the Torah in which it says, one thing I ask of you, only one thing. What is it? Yirat Hashem, which of course we usually translate as the fear of God. But of course it's the same word for having awe. And I think that what the interesting thing about, as complicated as human beings are, our physical manifestation of both fear and exhilaration are the same. Heightened, heartbeat and sweaty palms and, our face getting flush. You can feel exhilarated, and the same exact body expression happens when you feel fear. So if we could take this moment where actually we're feeling a lot of fear, and actually flip it with this sense of heightened emotional intensity, because that's actually what we're experiencing, is a heightened emotional intensity, and turn it from a sense of fear to awe. That is, I think, the goal. If that can be the one thing we experience in some way, and to feel that same level of excitement. And by the way, I feel that there is that flipping happening in the same way that our, synagogue has been more full than ever, and high holidays were bursting at the seams, and people came perhaps because they're feeling more fearful. But then when we're all singing together, we're like, this is awesome. And I mean that in the true sense of the religious sense of awe. We feel the strength, and all of it feels more meaningful because we are feeling this heightened sense of everything. So I think that that to me is going to be the key for us to take this moment and maybe understand that it might have come from this place of our heart is racing faster because of something bad, and actually turn that into a sense of the awe of the experience of what it is to be a Jew and to feel the power and engagement of it. So,
Amen.
Okay, I get one last question, I guess. Well, so I'm not going to do any of these. I'm just going to say, what has made you, in some ways this is kind of where we're getting, what has made you most hopeful in the last year? And you've also been doing this book tour. So you've been traveling, I think, around the country. You've definitely been to a lot of Jewish communities. What has maybe surprised you or given you a sense of hopefulness as you're coming through this year? What's been your awe moments?
I have the best job in the world.
No, I
Right.
have the best job in the world. But okay.
We have the best
Yes,
job
we
in the
do.
world. I think we get to use our gifts to inspire communities, to aspire to be the Jews that they seek to be, and
And human beings.
and human beings. And so I am actively serving the Park Avenue Synagogue community, but I have spent time with other communities on this book tour, and I think that sense of hunger, that sense of thirst, of being engaged with other communities who are looking for their Esther moment. The message, right, I wrote a book and raised some money and lead a community, but I think the most inspiring part of this moment, with a caveat that none of us want this moment, is to see everyone who has taken agency for their lives, for their Jewish lives, right? For some, it's to write a check. For others, it's to sign up for a class. For others, it's to come to services on a Friday night. For others, it is to a young person who is leading the charge in their high school for positive assertions of Jewish identity. People are stepping up to their Esther moment in a way that perhaps they themselves didn't know that they were capable of doing. So I think there are a million Esther moments of this moment of people stepping up.
So just offering my deepest thanks to you, Elliot, for being my rabbi, for being a rabbi for our larger community, for being such a teacher. When I wrote you after I read your book that I was like, you helped me understand and articulate, I think, so many of the kind of major challenges and didn't answer everything. So it left a place for us to kind of continue the conversation. I encourage you to all get the book. Rabbi Cosgrove is going to go upstairs and he'll sign books upstairs. So I am going to ask that you guys not mob him at the front, but let him go upstairs so that we can mob him upstairs. But then we have a little more room, and so that he can actually have a chance to sign books. But it is. And just a personal gratitude that we get to be in this conversation and in this work together. Like it really is such a gift to have such a wise friend to throw around these great, in some ways unanswerable questions together, and to know that we're not alone in it, and to be able to do it with these incredible communities. And I really do think of our communities as sister congregations with each other in so many ways. And so thank you so much, all of you, for coming out. You make Central look good in front of Rabbi Cosgrove, to have such a wonderful community show up for this kind of a conversation. So I want to thank all of you for coming out tonight.